that feeling,
Hmm.
like something essential has just shifted, maybe a silence where there used to be sound. Loss? Well, in its many forms, it's really a universal part of being human, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
It touches every life, really, regardless of age, background, or, where you are in the world.
Yeah,
And the impact, it stretches far beyond just that initial moment.
that's so true. And in this deep dive, we're going to try and unpack this really fundamental human experience loss and, well, the profound response it triggers.
Right.
Grief.
Right.
And we're not just going on like personal feelings here. We've looked at a huge amount of information, actually using AI to analyze grief through, an incredible range of perspectives.
Exactly. We're talking about how loss has been understood across human history, what actually happens in our bodies and minds, philosophical ideas about it, and even some maybe surprising ways to think about it, using concepts from physics, math, logic, that kind of thing.
Yeah, trying to connect those dots.
Our goal here is really to distill the core of all this information into clear, engaging insights. Those moments where something you've maybe always felt suddenly clicks, makes a bit more sense.
Right, without getting bogged down in overly academic language.
Definitely.
Our mission really is to provide you with a rapid but still thorough understanding of the core ideas of loss and grief, and to explore their wide-ranging implications in a way that hopefully resonates with your own experiences.
Okay, so let's get right into it then. When we talk about loss and grief, what are we really talking about, like at their most basic level?
Well, at its heart, loss is. It's when something or someone you were connected to is no longer there in the same way. You can think of it as a break in a bond, maybe the absence of something that was once part of your life.
Okay.
And grief. Grief is the whole complex mix. Emotions, physical sensations, thoughts, behaviors, social adjustments, even spiritual questions that just naturally arise when that connection gets broken.
So it's much more than just feeling sad for a little while.
Oh, absolutely. Grief is a deeply multifaceted experience.
Right.
And it's really crucial to remember that it's completely natural. And, given that loss is just an inherent part of life, it's an unavoidable human experience, too.
It feels like loss comes in so many forms, doesn't it? It's definitely not just about someone dying.
Precisely. Yeah, the analysis highlighted a really wide range of losses that can trigger grief. The death of someone we love, a child, a parent, a partner, that's perhaps the most obvious, the most profound. But think about the loss of a relationship through divorce or a breakup, or even when family members become estranged. That could be just as painful, honestly.
Right. That sense of connection just being severed.
Exactly. Then there's the loss of your physical health or abilities, maybe due to a long-term illness and injury, or, simply as we age.
Yeah.
Or consider the loss of a dream you held dear, like a career setback that really changes your path, or an ambition that just doesn't come to fruition. Or even that sort of bittersweet feeling when your children leave home, the empty nest.
The emptiness, yeah, that's the loss of a daily dynamic, isn't it? A shift in your role.
Exactly. And your sense of who you are, your identity, that can also be shaken by things like retirement, losing your job, or moving to a completely new place.
Right.
We can even grieve the loss of possessions, especially if they held deep meaning for us, like after a natural disaster or a theft. The loss of feeling safe and secure after some kind of trauma or experiencing violence, that's another really profound form of loss. And for some people, a crisis of faith or questioning deeply held beliefs, that can also bring about a kind of grief.
And the AI analysis even brought up the idea of environmental loss, which honestly I hadn't really considered in this context before.
Yes, that was interesting. The damage to natural environments, the extinction of species, the effects of climate change, these can lead to a really deep sense of grief, a loss of connection to the natural world around us.
Wow.
It really just emphasizes how all-encompassing loss can potentially be.
It's quite sobering, really, to think about how long humans have been dealing with this stuff. What did the analysis reveal about how grief has been understood, say, throughout history?
Well, what's fascinating is that even way back in ancient civilizations, we see clear signs of rituals, designed to process loss. Think about Egyptian mummification or Greek mourning songs, Roman funeral ceremonies.
Yeah.
These weren't just practicalities. They were communal ways of acknowledging death and starting to navigate the grief that comes with it.
So it tells us that this need to mourn is really deep-seated.
Very deep-seated, yes. Even back then, there was an understanding of this need for, collective grieving. Precisely.
Yep.
Now, if we jump forward to, say, the medieval period, the impact of widespread disease and high death rates, It's just undeniable. Look at the art and literature of that time. It's filled with themes of mortality, constantly reminding people how fragile life was, how common loss was.
Yeah, a very different reality than what many of us experience today.
Absolutely. And while modern medicine has extended lifespans in many parts of the world, the analysis points out that we now face kind of new kinds of loss.
How so?
Well, think about our digital lives. What happens to our online presence when we're gone? That creates a new kind of absence, right? A new type of legacy.
Oh, interesting.
And tragically, large-scale displacement due to conflict and environmental changes has led to mass loss on an unprecedented scale in some regions today.
And those major historical events, wars, natural disasters, they must tie into this.
Oh, absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, these huge events are fundamentally defined by widespread loss. They shape entire societies, they change national identities, and they can have really long-lasting effects on how communities function afterwards.
So it's really not just a personal experience. It has these real, tangible consequences for whole societies.
Definitely.
Okay, now let's maybe move inwards a bit. What actually happens in our bodies when we grieve? The analysis looked into the biology of grief, right?
Yes, it did. And it's quite remarkable, actually, how grief impacts our physical being. It triggers what is essentially a stress response. Our bodies release hormones like cortisol and adrenaline.
The fight or flight stuff?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Our heart rate and blood pressure can fluctuate, and it can even affect our immune system, potentially making us more vulnerable to illness. The analysis suggests that prolonged grief might even contribute to ongoing inflammation in the body.
So grief isn't just something we feel emotionally. It has a genuine physical impact.
Exactly. And when we look at the brain, imaging studies show that grief activates specific areas. There's the anterior cingulate cortex. You can kind of think of it as the brain's ouch center.
Okay.
Registering not just physical pain, but also the emotional pain of absence. The insula, which is linked to our internal bodily states and emotions, and the amygdala, our sort of emotional hub, they're also highly active as the brain tries to process the loss.
It's like the brain is scrambling to make sense of this new reality where someone or something important is just missing.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And what about our genes? Are some people just, wired to grieve more intensely?
Well, what's interesting here is that while grief itself isn't something directly passed down through genes, like eye color,
Right.
there's evidence suggesting that certain genetic variations might influence how we regulate our emotions. And that, in turn, could affect our susceptibility to prolonged or complicated grief.
Oh, okay.
This might involve systems in the brain that use chemicals like serotonin, for example, to manage mood.
So not a specific grief gene then, but maybe genes that influence our emotional resilience, perhaps.
Precisely. That's a better way to think about it. And from an evolutionary standpoint, the analysis highlighted a pretty fascinating idea. The capacity for grief might have actually helped early human communities survive.
Really? How?
Well, the strong attachments that cause us to grieve when they're broken also fostered cooperation and protection within those early groups. Attachment was key.
Huh. Grief is a consequence of our fundamental need to connect and belong. That's actually a really powerful way to look at it.
It is, isn't it?
Now, shifting gears a bit into the realm of ideas.
How have philosophers tried to understand grief?
The philosophical perspectives offer some really profound ways of thinking about it. Existentialism, for instance, emphasizes how loss forces us to confront the fact that, our time is limited.
Right.
And it can bring up big questions about the meaning of life and the need for us to kind of create our own meaning, especially when facing suffering.
Yeah, it definitely shines a harsh light on our own mortality.
Exactly. Then you have Stoicism, which suggests we should focus on what we can control and try to accept what we cannot, including loss and death. The idea there is that by managing our emotional responses to these inevitable events, we can minimize our suffering.
Easier said than done when you're actually grieving, I would imagine.
Oh, absolutely. But it offers a framework maybe for finding some inner peace. Buddhism, too, with its focus on the idea that everything is constantly changing impermanence, anicca, and that suffering, dukkha, arises from our attachment to things.
It views grief as a direct result of clinging to what we know, logically, will eventually change or end.
So letting go of those attachments is seen as a way to reduce suffering.
That's a central principle, yes.
Yeah.
And then maybe at the other end of the spectrum, the analysis touched on nihilism, which suggests that for some people, experiencing a really significant loss can lead to a feeling that life is ultimately without meaning or purpose.
Yeah.
A real crisis.
It really shows how loss can just shake the very foundations of what we believe about the world and our place in it.
Absolutely.
Now, the analysis got really interesting, I thought, when it started drawing analogies from physics and mathematics. These aren't meant to be taken literally, are they?
No, you're spot on there. These are definitely conceptual analogies. Using ideas from other fields just to give us a different way to think about grief.
Okay.
So take entropy in physics, the natural tendency of systems to move towards disorder. You could see loss, maybe in a metaphorical sense, as a kind of breakdown of a personal system, relationship, your health, leading to a new state of sort of disorganization.
Like things naturally just fall apart over time.
In a metaphorical way, yes. Another analogy mentioned was phase transitions, like water turning into ice or steam. Grief can feel like a really disruptive, turbulent shift from one state of being.
Having that person or thing.
Exactly. To a completely different state of absence. And it requires a lot of energy to adjust and find a new kind of balance.
Yeah, a real upheaval in your internal world.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And mathematically, the way grief often comes in waves, doesn't it? With ups and downs and unexpected setbacks.
Totally.
That mirrors the nonlinear dynamics we see in complex systems, where small changes can have big, unpredictable consequences. Loss can also be thought of in terms of set theory. If you consider your life as a set of important elements, removing a crucial element fundamentally changes the whole set, the whole picture.
That makes sense.
And of course, probability and statistics just remind us that the likelihood of experiencing loss increases over time. And we can observe patterns in how people grieve, even though each individual's experience is ultimately unique.
It's fascinating how these quite abstract ideas can offer a new lens on something so deeply personal.
It is.
Okay, so now let's talk about the logic of grief, if that's even the right word. Is there a rational way to approach something so driven by emotion?
Well, this raises a really important point. Grief often presents a kind of paradox, right? Intellectually, we understand that a loss has occurred, but emotionally, we can still feel the presence of what's gone.
Yeah.
Logically, a person who has died is no longer with us, but our memories, the impact they had, they continue to be very real, very present. Grief can also lead to what psychologists call cognitive distortions, illogical thought patterns, like blaming ourselves unfairly or engaging in magical thinking, maybe wishing things were different, where our emotions kind of hijack our rational thought processes. And while we can intellectually accept that death is inevitable, the emotional acceptance of a specific loss is often a much longer and more difficult process.
So our heads and our hearts are often in conflict during grief.
Very often, yes. And this internal struggle, it plays out in our state of mind and our belief systems, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The analysis really highlighted the intense emotional turmoil that can accompany grief, a whole range of feelings. Deep sadness, despair, sure, but also anger, guilt, confusion, maybe even moments of unexpected relief sometimes, or intense longing.
It's a real storm.
Yeah. And cognitively, we might struggle to focus, have trouble with our memory, find ourselves just constantly dwelling on the loss, ruminating.
And for many, grief can trigger a spiritual crisis. It can cause them to question their faith, their purpose in life, their understanding of suffering.
Or, as you said, it could go the other way.
Or on the other hand, it can sometimes lead to a strengthening of existing beliefs, providing comfort and a sense of continuity. And sometimes the experience of loss can fundamentally change our priorities and lead to the development of entirely new perspectives on life and death.
It really is a profound internal shift. And crucially, it doesn't just affect the person grieving, does it? The analysis talked about ripple effects.
That's absolutely right. For individuals, the impacts can be incredibly far-reaching, affecting their emotional, physical, cognitive, behavioral, and spiritual well-being, as we've touched on. Within families, loss can disrupt established patterns, force changes in roles, and unfortunately, sometimes it can lead to tension or conflict. But it can also, in moments of shared grief, really strengthen family bonds.
Yeah, bring people together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Friends might feel unsure of how to offer support, sometimes leading to them withdrawing awkwardly, while in other cases, grief can deepen existing friendships. And on a broader level, loss impacts social networks, productivity in the workplace, the overall cohesion of communities. Collective grief after a major event can even become a catalyst for social movements or political change. We see that happen.
It truly touches every layer of society, which leads to the question, how does society in general tend to respond to grief?
Well, what's really interesting is the vast diversity of cultural norms surrounding grief. Every culture seems to have its own unique set of rituals, traditions, expectations for how mourning should be expressed.
Yeah.
It can range from very outward displays of emotion to more reserved practices, specific clothing, maybe designated periods of isolation or mourning.
Right.
The strength and availability of social support systems within a community also play a critical role in how individuals navigate their grief. And in more modern societies, we've seen the development of medical and psychological approaches, therapy, medication, alongside the growth of support groups.
But there's also sometimes a tendency, particularly in some societies, to kind of avoid talking about it, isn't there? A bit of a taboo.
Yes, definitely. Particularly in many Western cultures, death and grief have become somewhat private matters, maybe hidden away, which can lead to discomfort, a lack of understanding, or just inadequate support for those who are grieving.
Yeah.
And the analysis also pointed to the significant commercial aspect surrounding grief. The grief industry, you might call it, which certainly raises questions about how we handle such a vulnerable human experience.
Which brings us to some of the, let's say, trickier aspects. The analysis touched on some ethical considerations around grief, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Things like the importance of not invalidating someone's grief, telling them how they should feel or how long it should take.
Right, avoiding those comparisons.
Exactly. Also, the potential for exploiting grief, perhaps commercially or emotionally. The need for cultural sensitivity in offering support. Ensuring proper care for the grieving, telling the truth around loss, especially in medical contexts, and respecting end-of-life decisions. Even the idea of environmental grief raises ethical questions about our responsibilities.
That's a lot to consider. Now, a big part of this analysis involved AI. What's the potential role for AI in all this? Could it actually help improve things?
Well, the potential is quite significant, theoretically. AI could help enhance our understanding by analyzing vast amounts of data to find patterns in grief responses, maybe even develop predictive models for who might be at higher risk for complicated grief.
Like a risk score, how would that even work?
Conceptually, yes. Imagine identifying key factors, say, type of loss, social support, previous mental health, coping styles, and weighting them based on data analysis to calculate a score indicating potential vulnerability. It's complex, but the idea is personalized risk assessment.
Interesting.
AI could also potentially improve access to support, maybe through chatbots, offering initial guidance, helping people navigate resources, or even adapting support to different languages and cultural contexts.
Okay.
And in research, AI could accelerate drug discovery for related conditions like depression, analyze the effectiveness of different therapies, or provide new insights from brain imaging data related to grief processing.
But there must be ethical concerns with using AI for something so sensitive.
Oh, absolutely huge ones. Data privacy is paramount. We need to avoid bias in the algorithms, which could disadvantage certain groups. There's the risk of manipulation or replacing genuine human connection, which is so vital in grief.
Yeah, you wouldn't want an AI telling you how to feel.
Precisely. AI's role should be support, not defining what good grief looks like. The human element has to remain central.
That makes sense. Okay, so moving on, the analysis also touched on how art reflects human struggle and grief.
Yes, absolutely. Art in its many forms, music, painting, literature, poetry, it serves as such a fundamental way for humans to express and process grief.
Right.
It provides an outlet for intense emotions, a means of connecting with others who've experienced similar losses, maybe finding meaning or even beauty in the midst of suffering. We see this across all cultures throughout history. AI could even analyze these expressions, perhaps, to understand collective moods or themes.
And linking this to human struggles more broadly.
Well, when we consider things like war, poverty, widespread illness, these are often major drivers of loss and profound grief on a massive scale. They highlight our shared vulnerability and the impact of societal factors on individual lives. AI might help model the ripple effects of such events.
And in the face of all this pain, people turn to various ways of coping, some, well, more helpful than others, right?
Exactly. The analysis looked at coping mechanisms. Some are maladaptive, like turning to drugs, alcohol, maybe excessive behaviors like workaholism, or even risky sex, often as attempts to numb the pain or avoid confronting the reality of the loss.
Trying to escape it.
Yeah. AI might potentially help identify patterns indicative of such distress and suggest healthier alternatives. On the other hand, you have adaptive coping strategies, things like seeking truth, relying on healthy relationships, finding solace in faith or spirituality, engaging in self-care. AI could potentially help identify and promote these resources.
So distinguishing between numbing and actually processing. The analysis also delved into understanding emotions and intent during grief, trying to figure out why people act the way they do.
Yes, grief is such a complex emotional landscape, isn't it? It's not just sadness. It can involve anger, confusion, guilt, maybe even moments of unexpected laughter or relief as coping mechanisms. AI, through things like facial or vocal analysis or text sentiment analysis, might help recognize this spectrum, but
But understanding the purpose behind it is harder.
much harder. Human behaviors during grief have underlying motivations, often complex and subconscious. Someone might seem angry, but underneath they're deeply afraid or hurt. AI might eventually help in understanding patterns, but the why often requires deep human insight and empathy.
It always comes back to that human element, and grief has such a profound impact on just our basic needs, doesn't it? Concentration, sleep, eating.
Absolutely. It can massively disrupt our sleep patterns, our appetite, our ability to concentrate, our energy levels, our overall physical well-being. This can have a really significant knock-on effect on our daily functioning and long-term health.
Could AI help monitor that?
Potentially. You could imagine AI analyzing health metrics from wearables, maybe suggesting improvements like specific nutrition, exercise routines, or meditation practices tailored to someone grieving. In large-scale disasters, it might even help allocate resources for basic needs more effectively.
It's interesting to consider the origins of our understanding of grief itself. The analysis touched on that as well, right? Where did it come from?
Yeah, it's likely that the capacity for grief, or at least the precursors to it, evolved alongside the development of strong social bonds in our early human ancestors. That very act of forming close relationships, which was crucial for survival, also inherently created the potential for grief when those bonds were broken.
So it's deeply rooted in our evolution as social beings.
Exactly. And our understanding of grief is definitely still in the making. It's constantly evolving as we learn more through research in psychology, neuroscience, sociology, and other fields. AI is becoming a tool that might accelerate that learning process.
And our personal understanding of grief also changes throughout our own lives, doesn't it? When do we really get it?
That's a great point. A young child experiences and understands grief very differently than an adolescent grappling with identity, or an adult whose experiences are shaped by accumulated past losses and their current stage of life. Our capacity to comprehend the permanence of loss and develop coping strategies really develops over time.
Could AI offer age-appropriate resources then?
That's a potential application, yes. Developing tailored educational materials or guidance tools for different developmental stages, both for children experiencing grief and for adults supporting them.
Now, there was a provocative idea in the analysis. Could AI help make life easier to the point where a person can feel good all the time, even during grief? Is that desirable or even possible?
Yeah, that's a really important point to address critically. The goal of AI and grief support shouldn't be to eliminate grief or create constant happiness. Grief is a natural, albeit painful process. Trying to bypass it entirely is likely unhealthy.
So it's not about suppression.
No. AI's role should be focused on mitigating unnecessary suffering and facilitating healthy processing. For example, instead of trying to eliminate sadness, an AI might suggest journaling about feelings, or connecting with a therapist or support group, or engaging in a remembered positive activity. It's about support, not erasure.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction. So, boiling it down, what are the key takeaways people need to know about AI's role in understanding grief?
I think there are a few key things. First, AI is a tool that complements human connection and empathy. It absolutely does not replace it. Second, AI can provide powerful data-driven insights that might deepen our understanding of grief patterns and individual needs. And third, maintaining strong ethical boundaries, privacy, fairness, transparency is absolutely non-negotiable.
Right. Who do you see benefiting most from these AI applications right now or in the near future?
Well, potentially, individuals who are geographically isolated or lack access to traditional support could benefit from AI tools. Also, maybe people experiencing particularly complicated or prolonged grief, where identifying specific patterns could inform treatment. Healthcare professionals could use AI insights for better assessment and planning. Researchers obviously stand to gain a lot. And sport organizations might use AI to manage resources or tailor outreach more effectively.
Okay. Now, what about the tension between logic and emotion? Can AI help make a better logical case for humans to understand that, say, life is all there is, and when someone dies, grief isn't logically necessary for the person who's gone?
That's a fascinating question that touches on those philosophical points again. AI could certainly present logical arguments or philosophical perspectives like stoicism or some interpretations of impermanence. It can lay out the rational case that the deceased person is no longer suffering or aware. But grief isn't primarily about the deceased person's state. It's about the living person's experience of absence, the broken attachment, the emotional reality of loss. AI can present logic, but it can't force emotional acceptance or negate the deeply human need to mourn. It's like, a robot explaining why a broken cup isn't sad. The explanation might be logical, but it misses the owner's emotional connection to the cup.
That's a great analogy. It doesn't compute the feeling.
Exactly.
On a darker note, the analysis sometimes contrasted grief with a lack of empathy, like in cases of people who intentionally cause harm or kill others. How does that fit in?
Well, such cruelty often stems from a profound lack of empathy, distorted attachment patterns, or severe psychological issues. The grief of victims or their families is simply not a factor in the perpetrator's thinking.
It's like the grief response is completely absent or overridden in them.
Or twisted, perhaps. AI's potential role here is more in areas like risk factor analysis for violence or maybe forensic psychology, analyzing patterns, but again, with massive ethical guardrails needed. The purpose behind cruel actions is usually centered on power, control, or some internal pathology, completely detached from the suffering caused.
It's a chilling contrast to the depth of feeling and grief. What if someone or something were, say, born or created without that sense of humanity? How would an entity like that, or even current AI, understand grief?
An entity like that would likely process loss purely as data, information change, the removal of an element from a system. It could recognize patterns, understand the concept of grief based on observed human behavior, but it wouldn't feel the emotional weight, the pain, the longing.
So like AI today?
Essentially, yes. Current AI processes information about grief symptoms, responses, theories, but it doesn't experience the subjective, quality-rich reality of it. It lacks consciousness and embodied emotion.
So for humans to trust AI in this area, what beliefs are necessary? What do we need to keep in mind?
We need to trust in the ethical design and oversight of these systems. We need a clear understanding of AI's limitations. It's a tool, not a sentient counselor. And ideally, we should cultivate a belief in AI as a potential empowering tool, one that can augment human capabilities for understanding and support rather than replacing them. Transparency is key.
Right. Now, people react so differently to loss and even to things meant to be supportive. Why is there such subjectivity? Like, why might some people find dark humor helpful during grief while others find it appalling?
Oh, that's down to the incredible diversity of individual human experience. Resilience levels differ. Coping mechanisms vary wildly based on personality and past experiences. Our cultural background, the specific circumstances of the loss, our existing mental health, our support network, all these factors play a huge role.
Context and timing matter too, right?
Hugely. A joke that might land well weeks later could be devastating hours after a loss. AI might eventually get better at analyzing patterns of response and recognizing subjective perceptions based on data, but predicting an individual's reaction in a specific moment remains incredibly complex. It highlights why human judgment and sensitivity are irreplaceable.
And this diversity extends beyond individual reactions, doesn't it? The analysis mentioned how humans are in such different circumstances when dealing with loss. Why is that, and where does it lead?
Well, human lives are shaped by a vast web of differing circumstances: socioeconomic status, cultural norms, access to education and healthcare, exposure to trauma, political stability. The list is endless. These factors profoundly influence how we experience loss, the resources we have to cope, and the support available to us.
So grief isn't experienced in a vacuum.
Not at all. AI could potentially help map these complex interdependencies, maybe identify systemic inequalities in grief support, and help tailor interventions to specific community needs. But it really underscores that there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
This connects to the interconnectedness of life itself, right? Not just humans.
Yes. The analysis touched upon the reality that loss isn't exclusively human. Think about ecological grief, the loss felt due to environmental destruction, species extinction. It highlights the interconnectedness of all living beings and ecosystems. A loss in one part of the system impacts others.
Can AI model that?
AI is actually already being used to model ecological impacts, track biodiversity loss, and predict consequences of environmental change, which feeds into our understanding of these larger-scale losses.
So given all this diversity in circumstances and responses, how can AI help tailor support effectively?
Ideally, AI could help by first identifying an individual's existing coping strategies, perhaps through interaction or analyzing communication patterns, with consent, of course. Then, based on vast data sets of what has helped others in similar situations, it could offer personalized suggestions, maybe recommending specific types of therapy, support groups, readings, or activities.
And track if they're working.
Potentially, yes. By monitoring progress indicators, again, ethically and with consent, it could help refine the support plan over time, but always as a suggestion, not a directive.
We talked about the physical side earlier. Can AI help monitor the physical toll of grief more directly?
Yes, through biometric data from wearables, for example.
Yeah.
AI could analyze heart rate variability, sleep patterns, activity levels, things known to be affected by grief, and identify concerning trends. And then, perhaps, offer personalized recommendations for things like nutrition adjustments, gentle exercise routines, or mindfulness practices known to help regulate the stress response, potentially linking users to relevant resources or professionals.
Okay. Let's talk about rights and equity. The analysis mentioned freedom in beliefs and undermined privileges. How does that relate to grief?
It relates in a couple of ways. Firstly, there's the fundamental right to grieve in one's own way, according to one's own beliefs and cultural practices, without judgment or pressure to conform. Freedom of belief applies here, too.
And the privilege aspect.
Access to adequate grief support therapy, time off work, strong social networks is often a privilege tied to socioeconomic status, location, and other factors. Not everyone has equal opportunity to grieve in a supported way.
And AI's role here.
AI could potentially help identify these disparities by analyzing access data and outcomes across different demographics. It can maybe advocate for more equitable resource distribution, or help create more accessible forms of support, like free or low-cost digital tools.
That leads to a question the analysis raised. Why don't we typically teach children how to deal with grief proactively?
That's a really poignant question. Often adults themselves are uncomfortable with death and grief, and they project that discomfort onto children, wanting to shield them. There might be uncertainty about how to explain complex concepts in an age-appropriate way, or a fear of causing more distress.
So we avoid it.
We often do. But avoidance doesn't really help in the long run. AI could potentially assist here by providing resources, age-appropriate educational materials for kids, guidance and scripts for adults on how to have these difficult conversations, making it less daunting.
Okay, almost wrapping up, the analysis touched on attempts to quantify or calculate aspects of grief using logic. Can you briefly explain those concepts?
Sure. These are conceptual frameworks, remember, not exact formulas for feeling. One idea is the probability of loss, simply acknowledging that the chance of experiencing various losses increases over a lifetime. Another is impact assessment, conceptually represented perhaps as IG equals FML, where impact is a function of the magnitude of the loss and the vulnerability of the individual. It's just a way to think about how different factors combine.
And resilience.
Resilience could be thought of as inversely related to vulnerability. Maybe $1 in valor way or $1 a mal. And time to adapt might be proportional to how vulnerable someone is. So adapt propped over 5 tatters. Higher resilience, faster adaptation conceptually.
And ethical dilemmas.
Even those could be framed conceptually, like quantifying the potential benefit versus harm of an action related to grief support, though reducing ethics purely to numbers is obviously problematic. These are just abstract ways to structure thinking about complex factors.
Right. Helpful frameworks, not precise measurements.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the complexities of loss and grief, what's one final thought you think our listeners should really consider, maybe take away with them?
Perhaps it's just to really recognize the sheer breadth and depth of loss, the many, many forms it can take in our own lives and in the lives of those around us. Sometimes grief shows up in really unexpected ways, linked to losses we haven't even consciously named. Acknowledging it in ourselves and in others without judgment, that can often be the very first and maybe the most crucial step towards healing and finding a way to move forward, even with the loss. It's about validation, really.
That's powerful, acknowledging the presence of grief even when it's not obvious. This has been a truly comprehensive look at something so fundamental to being human. Thank you.
This is DigitView.